The Foundry. Old, gray, and metal to the core.
Welcome to the Foundry. I'm Bruce.
And I am Nick Ettinger, and I'm the vocalist for Frost Like Ashes. And today we're doing something a little different, aren't we, Bruce?
Yeah, so I think you pitched this idea to me like a month or two ago, and things have happened that were unavoidable, so we missed a month. But you pitched this idea of like a classic album that has sort of stuck with you forever, if I took the assignment correctly, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it was really tough for me because, as I imagine it was for you, because there's a lot of records that, you know, play into my early childhood or early metal days or something like that. Not even metal, I guess. It could have been anything, but
right.
You know, because the first one I always tell a story of, my first one was Diary of a Madman by Ozzy was the first record I bought that just totally sucked me in. And that was a good candidate for this one.
Yeah.
In the end, when I started thinking about it, there was only one clear winner. So I'm going to let you go ahead and tell us what yours was first, and then we can figure it out from there.
Okay. So I picked Sabotage, Hall of the Mountain King, similar to what you talked about with Ozzy. I think this album was, I believe, the first one I bought of them, and one of my first albums I ever bought.
Nice.
So, and I mean, I listen to it to this day. So that's why I picked that one.
Right.
So what did you pick?
So I went with Mob Rules. So I'm always been a big Sabbath fan, and there's not much of a difference from the Ozzy record to this one. I also could have picked Holy Diver. That's another one that just completely stands out. Like those three I had trouble deciding on when you hit me with this assignment. But they're all sort of similar, I guess, in the end anyway. Or somehow connected.
Yeah, you know, I have a friend who is a huge Sabbath fan, and he insists that all of Ozzy's work is better than all of Dio's work. So I kind of, so it's interesting that you selected this one when I know you are an Ozzy fan as well.
Yes.
What's your opinion on that? I know that doesn't really apply to this album necessarily.
It doesn't apply to it, and I think everything that Ozzy did, including the newer stuff, you know, like 13 or whatever, he's classic, and he's always going to be, you know, the guy for me. But this record, I love Tony Iommi's guitar playing and his riffs from the early days. It's got that. Dio's just got that certain... I don't think this was his first one with them. I think this was like number 2, right? Heaven and Hell was first.
Yep.
So yeah, he's just got this thing. It's almost like magical when those guys play together. And then the rest of the band is the band, you know. But I love Tony's riffs and combine them with Dio's unbelievable vocals, and this was a no-brainer. Yeah.
You know, you're gonna revoke my metalhead card here. I never really listened to Black Sabbath early on because, you know, I bought my very first metal album in 1997, and that was The Best of Metal Blade Volume 2.
Yeah.
And before that, it was just all tape trading. So while I had heard a few of these songs, we didn't necessarily write down what the names of the songs were, right. or we just put the song, but not the, you know, not what album they're from or whatever. It was just, right. You know, cassette tapes or whatever. And so while I had heard some of these songs, I always, in my mind, just thought of them as Dio. Even a couple off of the previous Black Sabbath album. Right. I always just thought in my mind as Dio because Dio is already, you know, releasing albums by that point. This was, while I had heard some of these songs before, it also was a little bit of a new listen with my head understanding fully, okay, this is Black Sabbath. I'm listening to this album and the first time listening to the album as a whole. You know, one thing that was a little frustrating is I could not find an original version of this album anywhere. Every single online service has the remastered
right
version.
I think I have this on. Yeah, I still have this on vinyl.
Yeah, see, that would have been really, really nice to have listened to,
Right.
to really hear it the way it was originally, because I have a feeling it sounds quite a bit different on the remastered version.
Sure.
But having said that, I mean, the production is just fantastic.
Right.
And especially when I was hopping back and forth between Sabotage and this album, this album's just so much better in just the production values.
And they're not too far apart, right? They're only maybe a couple of years, if that.
Yeah. Just
81 is this record, so I don't.
Yeah, about
like
6
86.
years.
Yeah.
86, 87. So about 6 years difference. Obviously, the budget between the two bands is significantly different, right? But you had talked about the guitar playing, matched with Dio's vocals.
Yeah.
And I feel like some of the songs on this were kind of revealing Dio coming into his own vocal style finally, like Turn Up the Night and Southern Cross.
Yes.
But there is still some older style Dio, like from the previous album and some of his stuff before that in Rainbow, like Country Girl, as an example. So, it was really interesting for me to listen to these songs and hear Dio kind of coming into his prime, what I always understood
associated with Dio, right?
Yeah.
And it's weird you said, the comparison, because it's almost like the Hagar, David Lee Roth sort of comparison, right?
Yeah.
There's some, right when Sammy came into his own on that second album or whatever, it's sort of the same thing. And then it just seems like it. It just seems right, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And Dio, of course, started out as 50s rock and roll, right? So, I mean, he's changed a lot. But you could really hear that with Rainbow, him starting to create his own style and how he was going to fit into heavy metal.
And I think, and recreate it and redefine it almost. But I also think that, to your point earlier where you said he was coming into his own, maybe he was more comfortable because that first album he was replacing, a metal god for lack of a better word.
Right.
He kind of had to get in there and say, hey, I can really do this and do it well. And maybe that shows a little more.
I wonder if he had a little more input in the song development, possibly, with this album.
You got a lot more fantasy stuff going on, right? Because you got Falling Off the Edge of the World and that sort of thing. So he's starting to go into his signature Dio stuff almost, right? With all that fantasy world.
Yeah, but lyrically, I mean, he had kind of done that a little bit in Rainbow, but I guess the way the songs are arranged, the way the riffs are, those are very different. They're more advanced to me than what they did with any of the stuff that Ozzy sang on.
Right.
In fact, that was one of the notes I put. The riffs are really advanced in this album. I mean, they're really heavy when they need to be, which before, I mean, heavy was kind of their thing, right? They kind of invented heavy.
Right.
But now in this album, you could be heavy, they could be melodic, they could be soft. There was just lots of dynamics.
And his voice is just as dynamic to keep up with it, right? I mean, he's just as good in those softer passages as he is belting out, Mob Rules.
Yeah, exactly. Fantastic bass. Of course.
Yeah,
I mean, maybe that goes without saying.
Yeah, that whole bottom end there, him and Bill Ward, unbelievable.
Yeah, and then I noticed a very, very dirty guitar sound for the solos.
I don't know that that's very out of character for them. I think they're sort of that way. That's kind of what I like about Iommi. He's always been almost the same, I guess. He's got that sound I don't think anybody maybe came close to, except a band you're going to know quite well, Trouble.
Oh, yes. Yeah, but Trouble felt a little more processed.
Yeah. No, I agree. Overall, I think they were getting Bruce Franklin was getting really close to his tone.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You know, I guess the reason it kind of jumped out at me is that the rhythm guitars aren't dirty and sludgy like that. Right. They're nice and crisp and solid, right?
Yep.
And so then when you had these guitar solos come in that were just really, really harsh, it was a bit of a surprise.
So quick little story, and then I'll let you finish. But I was such a fan of this record that I don't know if you remember. You're probably close to my age. Did you guys used to paint denim jackets like with your favorite album cover on the back?
Well, people had them.
But you've seen them, right?
Painted them or put patches on them or whatever. Yeah.
So back then there weren't patches in the internet to get them so easily. People you'd pay like the art nerd, a bunch of money, and then he would do the album cover like on the back. And this was the first one I had. I was a little burnout metalhead, walking around with a Mob Rules jacket because this album was, I guess defined my childhood, or at least kept me in the metal scene then. Man,
you must have had a really talented.
I wish I had it. Yes, he was so. And what's even funnier? My second one, I had two of them, and the second one I did was the Yellow and Black Attack. So that's a bizarre combination. But
both of these albums came out when they were on cassette. So you had a side A and a side B, and that was kind of interesting. So it was kind of cool to see how this album kind of broke up. I don't know if they did it on purpose, but it felt to me like the first half of the album was kind of what was coming in the future, kind of the more modern Black Sabbath with the more modern Dio. And then the second half actually kind of reverted back to stuff that was similar to the previous album, except for Falling Off the Edge of the World. That one is kind of off on its own.
Yeah.
But, would you agree with that? Or?
I definitely would agree with that. And I was just curious, if you were to pick a song from each side, we'll do something a little bit different.
Oh, well, a song from each side. That is, well, I guess...
side one is easy, right? I mean, there's only one.
I don't know. I had set up my picks like we had normally been doing picks. Right. So 3 and then my top pick. So if I go side 1, my top pick is actually Voodoo.
Really?
And then on side 2 is Falling Off the Edge of the World. So both picks are kind of in the future Dio.
And we're close because I went with Mob Rules.
Of course. I knew that was going to be
that's an easy one. And then actually Falling Off the Edge of the World was was my second one if I'm picking off that side. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I think Mob
Rules is a pretty hammering sort of song, isn't it?
A great opener, a great everything, right? It gets everybody up and moving and out of your seat, and it's designed to do that. They do it well.
Yeah, and Voodoo is actually pretty kind of plotting almost. But then you have Turn Up the Night, which is quintessential Dio, isn't it? I mean, it could be on a Dio album almost.
Absolutely. That's what I liked about him. He straddled that line really well, I think, and more so than the first record.
Yeah,
I think it gave him, and I'm not taking anything away from Heaven and Hell because that's another one that probably could have been number 4 on my list. But I love this record, and if you haven't heard it, you live it under a rock, go grab it or listen to it or stream it if you could find it. I know you said it was hard, but
I could find it. I just only could get the remastered version,
right?
So it'd just been nice. If you're just going to go listen to it, I mean, I'm sure it's fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I would encourage people to listen to it, even if you've never listened to Black Sabbath before, or maybe aren't a Dio fan or are a Dio fan, but never listened to this album or whatever. Even if you compare this to the future Dio albums, just the production is so good. It just stands out. It sounds so good. And it really makes you wish that they could go back and re-record some of my other favorite albums.
Yeah.
As good as this one was recorded.
I 100% agree. So this is going to bring me to your pick. And I'm going to let you go ahead and reveal it, but I got a quick question for you. When I was listening to this, when you told me about it, this band, I think there's clearly, in my opinion, a better record than this one. from
in
their
I
catalog.
have a feeling that I know which one that is because you.
I probably told you, like, what the heck's wrong with you?
Yeah, you were like, what over this album? You know.
So go ahead and tell us, so then I can get my 2 cents in here.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, I picked Sabotage, Hall of the Mountain King, which was released in 1987. So, and then you were wondering how I could pick that over one of the previous albums, which was
Power of the Night.
Power of the Night. Yeah,
that's still in my regular rotation too. I listen to that constantly.
Well, and I think this, I'm going to, just to that point, I think that this kind of shows the difference between when you got into things and how much access you had to them based on where you lived compared to where I lived.
Right. And
when I got into things. And that might be the reason why, these 2 albums are different between us. But you go ahead and kind of give me your thoughts on this album.
So my thoughts, my early on thoughts are, I remember when this record came out. I don't know if in wherever you are, somewhere in Nebraska, wherever
North Dakota.
There you go.
North than Nebraska.
I remember they used to have this thing on at midnight or 11 o'clock every weeknight where they'd play, like, it was on UHF and it would be like an hour of metal videos. I don't know if you had that. It was kind of an alternative to MTV, like on public.
Back then we had 3 channels.
Okay. That's what I figured.
And no cable. So we had no video shows. We had no radio shows.
Oh, that's because I clearly remember, like, we used to watch. I was in college in the dorm, and we'd go down to the TV lounge event to try and watch the metal hour, and they played the living crap out of Hall of the Mountain King. That's a great. That was my introduction to the record. I mean, it's still probably my favorite song on here, but that was the introduction to it. And John Olivia is just like so much larger than life. I think. Yeah, he's got like this presence that I don't know. It's quite amazing.
Yeah. When you mentioned the other album, I was like, well, I wonder why. So I actually went back and I listened to that album several times through, as well as the other one. So this is, I think, their 3rd studio album. And
it's very different, though.
Yeah, it is very different. And one of the biggest differences, I think, is the fact that his vocals have developed considerably. They're in this album, they're much more intense than overall in the other 2 albums. Like in the other 2 albums, he gets to these points, but he doesn't maintain that intensity. Right. Like this album, he maintains it like almost all the way through. And it's really focused on his more harsher style of vocal and a higher register vocal. He has a great range. He has lots of different voices that he uses, and a lot of those smoother tones and things like that. They were really on display in the previous albums, and even in the later albums after this album as well. But for me, being really into vocals and really liking higher and harsher and things like that, it stuck with me. Although the reality is I never heard the other 2 albums before I heard this one. This was the very first Sabotage I ever heard. And it was the first Sabotage I purchased.
Right. And so you have that connection to it, and that makes sense.
And one of the first albums overall, I think it was the Metal Blade comp, and then Lizzie Borden, Menace to Society, and this one, I think, were the first 3. So
interesting. I think this record kind of is a bit more, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because you probably know it better than I do, a bit more proggy, a bit more power side. I mean, I think like the earlier stuff, at least Power of the Night, was definitely more like straight ahead metal, heavy rock kind of stuff. This one seemed a little more experimental. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The first 2 albums were really hard rock, heavy metal, like straight on heavy metal. Whereas this one, it was symphonic in a way, right? There was a real connection to classical music, even beyond them obviously using some actual classical music in some of the songs, like in Hall of the Mountain King,
Right.
And whatever that other prelude song is, that's 100% a classical, Prelude to Madness.
Yeah, that instrumental.
Yeah, so that's 100% just a classical song. So, so they were more akin to like Merciful Fate and King Diamond, where they actually wrote riffs just for the solos.
Right. And Chris
Like
Olivia.
Yeah.
Chris Olivia was, God rest his soul, was amazing at doing that.
Yeah. Heavy and intense and interesting, yet very melodic and fantastic riffs in every song. Great solos, like you said.
Yeah, and his playing changed, I think. I think the whole thing really just changed from what I got into listening to him. And maybe that was my issue with this record, because I never hated it, but I never really revisited it like I did, you know, Power of the Night or whatever. And maybe it has something to do with what you said, though, you know, what you get into him on and, you know, what you kind of grow up listening to. I don't know.
Yeah, and even if you go back to the Mob Rules album, you know, Mob Rules is your favorite song on there, which is a little more straightforward, a little more pounding, right, than some of the other songs on that album. And
that makes sense.
I think it kind of, and like I said at the beginning, I really think this plays into the access you had to music, how early you had access to it, and things like that. So I didn't have any access to really heavy metal until probably mid 80s. And it was all tape trading and things like that, you know? So, you know, the other part of this is that, and just like Dio, he's a great storyteller.
Yes.
Which this is a little different. Some of the songs on the earlier albums had some stories to them, but this allowed him to really tell some huge stories. So what were your top picks? Or I didn't really split them up by.
Oh, that's fine. I kind of just threw that at you. I don't mean to. So I guess side one, probably Legions.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's more of the straight metal, more of the straighter metal songs, if that makes sense to you.
Yep.
And then obviously Hall of the Mountain King, just because that's probably the first one. That was the one where I was like, holy crap.
It was completely different than anything that had been done, really.
And it's gone on to become sort of like an anthem, right, of the whole metal community. Yeah, it was very, very different. I can clearly remember him, you know, just belting that intro out. And
I saw them live, fortunately. And, you know, all these little vocal tricks that he did on the album, he did them perfectly live.
Really?
Enormous lung control and just air control to do these screams, those little short bursts, you know. He did them absolutely perfect. I was just blown away.
That's great.
So I took Hall of the Mountain King out of the mix because that would be the de facto favorite.
Right, I get it.
So I did pick Legions, White Witch and Devastation. They're from the side B, but they were also way up there. But Beyond the Doors of the Dark is
the opener
is my favorite on the album outside of the Hall of the Mountain King. And you know, that song, it reminds me a little bit of Testament off of Legacy.
Yeah, I could see that. And I could see that was a great statement of, you know, hey, we've changed. We didn't rewrite the same old records. This is who we are now.
Yeah, it's just all out intense. It's just
that makes sense.
crazy song, and I still sing along to it.
And both of these records are like 40 years old.
I know. and they still, for me, they're in the obviously up towards the top. And I think for you too. And obviously that's why we picked them. But both of these are fantastic albums to go and check out. You know, they're from the 80s, but they're not
dated.
Yeah, I mean, they did something new at the time.
Mm-hmm.
and they aren't good just because they were new at the time. They were good because they're actually good.
And they still hold up. I mean, like prepping for this show over the last however long month or two, I've listened to them both a lot, and they're relevant. I mean, they're just as good as anything that's coming out now.
Yeah. And Hall of the Mountain King is one of those albums. Maybe we'll have to do another episode on picking an album like this, but one of those albums that I like every single song on the album.
Yeah.
You know, there's a few of those over time, but they're not
many. Yeah, there's very few. Right.
And this is definitely one of them.
Well, cool. So if you made it this far, I want to say thank you. I also want to encourage you to please leave some feedback, hit the like button, tell us what jerks, tell us what album you think is the best, tell us why you think Power of the Night was probably better. Tell us anything, anything you want. We'd like to hear from you.
Yeah. And thank you very much for watching. You know, this is kind of a unique episode. Normally we're picking, each of us are picking a really heavy hit, and then we're picking a non-metal hit as well.
And I think if you care, if you're listening and you care, this gives us, the viewer, the listener, whatever, a good insight into where we both come from, right? Because they're very different.
Yeah, absolutely.
So cool. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, it's always nice to see you and talk about this stuff, and we'll definitely have to do this one again. There's a lot more on my list.
Right on.